Good morning. My name is Abraham. I thought it was time for me to speak to you since the Apostle Paul has been using me as an example in Romans. I thought you needed to hear from me today, because although I am honored by Jews, Muslims, and Christians, it seems that Christians know less about me than the sons of Isaac and the sons of Ishmael do. Another reason why I wanted to speak to you is because I come from the part of the world that has been in the headlines. I grew up in Iraq and eventually settled in what you know as Israel. And I also wanted to speak to you because some of you feel hopeless in your heart. I'd like to share my story so that you can find hope in a hopeless world. I should say at the beginning that I'm embarrassed at the thought that the Apostle Paul and others hold me up as an example. If you're going to copy anything about me, please don't mimic my conduct or follow my compromises. I am simply a man who strived to take God at his word. When God promised something, I tried to believe him, even though I bombed on several occasions. I even tried to make some things happen on my own timetable, but by God's grace, I was always drawn back to believing in the promises and power of God. Thankfully, I was not justified by my behavior, but my belief in God. I had been pretty comfortable living in Iraq when God appeared to me, giving me a command and a promise. Incidentally, this is always how God works. When we obey him, we experience his promises and we end up being blessed. God called me to leave my country, my people, and my family and go to a land that he would show me. I was told that God would make me into a great nation, that he would bless me, and through me all peoples on earth would be blessed. I didn't really understand this and certainly wondered why God would make that kind of promise to a pagan like me. But I obeyed, taking my wife Sarai and my nephew Lot with me. I was 75 years old at the time. I should also mention that while I obeyed and went to the land God directed me, at the first sign of trouble, I resorted to my own resources. Faced with a famine, instead of going to the Lord for help, I decided to go to Egypt. The very first words from my mouth recorded in Scripture involved deceit, and I told my wife to lie when the Egyptians asked who she was. I was horrified by what happened next and realized how sinister and selfish I can be. I was struck by how quickly I headed south when things got tough, not just geographically, but also spiritually. I suspect the same kind of horrible stuff has taken harbor in your hearts as well. God's promise that Sarai and I were going to have a child was both puzzling and maddening. I was way past my prime, and my sweet Sarai had never been able to have children. The only thing she had given birth to was hopelessness and despair. In our culture, childlessness was considered a curse. When I told my wife that we were going to have a child, she thought I was just playing a cruel joke on her. I remember negotiating with God and asking him if this promise could just be poured out on my servant Eliezer. God patiently redirected me, telling me to look up at the heavens and count the stars, telling me that I would have a son from my own body and that my offspring would outnumber the stars in the sky. God even entered into a covenant of blood with me to show how serious he was. After 10 years of living with no heir, Sarai's hopelessness led her to ask me to have a child with her servant Hagar. This was a surrogate solution, but it wasn't what God had wanted. When she got pregnant, Sarai was even more devastated and forced Hagar to flee into the wilderness. She gave birth to a son named Ishmael, who, though he was my boy, was not the son of promise. I was 86 years old at the time. When I was 99 years old, God confirmed his covenant with me and gave circumcision as the sign of it. I was learning to trust the Lord, even as I faced the facts about my own situation. I tried to not doubt. God told me again that Sarai and I would have a son. I wanted to believe, but I also was really struck with how funny all this was. I remember falling face down thinking about how funny it would be for a 100-year-old man to father a child with a 90-year-old wife. But then God got real specific in Genesis 17:21. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. When Sarah overheard that we were going to have a baby boy, she couldn't contain herself and laughed like crazy. God didn't really appreciate her guffaw because it revealed her lack of faith. But God was so gracious to her when he declared in Genesis 18:14, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Having faith is pretty funny, because it often flies in the face of facts. What's even funnier is that we did have a boy, and we named him Isaac, which means he laughs. Sarah has such a sweet spirit because after Isaac was born, I remember her saying, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." That's enough about me and my experience for now. With that as background, let's listen to how Paul applies my experience.